before the Iron Throne, before King's Landing, before the name Targaryen meant anything to the lords and small folk of Westeros. There was a continent divided, 7 kingdoms, or what men called 7 kingdoms, though the number was never quite right. Dozens of great houses, hundreds of petty lords, and a coastline of old stone castles that had never once looked east and feared what might be coming. Then came the dragons, not as legend, not as memory, as fire and shadow in the sky, blotting out the morning sun above a shore that had never seen their like. 3 of them, ancient and enormous and alive, in a way that no sword or castle wall could answer. And at their head, a silver-haired man on the largest beast the world had seen since Valyria fell. A man with a quiet face and a terrible purpose. His name was Aegon, and with him he brought 2 years of complete and utter chaos and destruction. It would reshape every great house on the continent. It would kill kings and spare others, would bend the proud and shatter the stubborn, and it would leave behind a throne built from the blades of fallen enemies, a throne no man could sit upon in comfort. This is that story. To understand what Aegon walked into, you must first understand what Westeros was. It was not one realm waiting to be united. It was not a single people dreaming of a king. It was a collection of proud and ancient kingdoms, each with its own history stretching back thousands of years, each with lords who had bled and fought and married and betrayed their way into dominion over their particular corner of the continent. In the far north, the Starks ruled from Winterfell. They called themselves Kings of Winter, and that title was not boastfulness, it was description. The north was vast and cold and half wild, and the Starks had held it through sheer endurance for 8,000 years. They were first men, old blood, tied to the land through ancient oaths sworn before weirwood trees whose carved faces had watched every generation of wolf kings come and go. They did not bend easily. They had never needed to. To the south of the neck, the Riverlands were a different matter entirely. That region had no single strong king of its own. It was contested ground. For generations it had passed from hand to hand, and at the time of the Conquest, it fell under the shadow of the Iron Islands. House Hoare held the rivers by force. Harren the Black was their king, a man of terrible ambition, who had spent 40 years constructing the greatest castle Westeros had ever seen. He called it Harrenhal. It sat at the edge of the God's Eye Lake, enormous and still unfinished, its towers so tall they seemed to sway when the wind came hard off the water. Harren had worked his men to death building it. The forests of the Reach had been stripped for timber. Every river lord had been demanded to pay tribute, and thousands of small folk had broken their backs to raise those towers. He believed Harrenhal would make him eternal. He believed it would stand forever. That belief would prove expensive. The Stormlands stretched along the eastern coast beneath the Riverlands. There sat House Durrandon, whose kings called themselves Storm Kings. Ancient blood. The Stormlands had faced the sea on one side and the Dornish marches on the other, and the Durrandons had survived both with their pride intact. Argilac the Arrogant was their king at the time of the Conquest. The name tells you something. He was old. He was fierce. He was not a man to bend. The Reach spread wide and golden to the west of the Stormlands, the most fertile land on the continent, the breadbasket of Westeros. The gardeners had ruled it since the Dawn Age. They called themselves Kings of the Reach, and they could back that title with the largest army in Westeros. House Gardener's seat was Highgarden, and they had grown accustomed to being the greatest power in the southern half of the continent. King Mern IX sat their throne when Aegon came. He was proud and strong, and had every reason to believe his kingdom could stand against any threat. To the west sat House Lannister and the Westerlands. Casterly Rock had loomed above its gold-rich lands for millennia. The Lannisters were not the oldest blood, but they were wealthy, their minds full, their armies well-equipped. King Loren Lannister ruled there. He was practical in the way rich men sometimes are. He understood that wealth only persisted when paired with strength. The Vale of Arryn perched high and cold behind its mountain passes. The Arryns had held it through geography as much as arms, for the Eyrie sat unreachable at the peak of the Mountains of the Moon, and the Giant's lance made approach by any enemy nearly impossible. Queen Regent Shara Arryn held the realm for her young son Ronal. She was ambitious and hopeful for her son's future. This hope was soon to be crushed. And then there was Dorne. Dorne was a country unto itself in ways that went beyond politics. Its people were different, mixed blood, Rhoynar customs, a unique way of fighting, and an interesting way of thinking. Dorne was ruled by the Martells seated in Sunspear, and they had never been fully conquered by anyone. Not the Andals, not the Durrandons, not the Reach. Their sun-baked deserts and mountain passes had swallowed armies whole. Princess Maria Martell was old and blind and enormously fat when the Conquest came, but she had a mind like a blade kept sharp from long use. She saw Aegon coming, and she made her plans. This was the continent Aegon crossed toward. Not a peaceful land yearning for order. Not a scattered collection of petty chieftains who would crumble at the first strong wind. These were proud kingdoms with deep roots and real power. Together, their forces could have dwarfed Aegon's host many times over. Castles that had stood for centuries still dominated the landscape, and the men who ruled them had not forgotten how to wage war. What they had not faced, in living memory, was dragons. That absence of experience was the whole of his advantage. There is a quieter observation that sits beneath the military one, though. These kingdoms were also exhausted by each other. The Reach and the Westerlands had been rivals for generations, their border a source of constant low-level friction that erupted into open war when the political weather allowed. The Stormlands and Dorne had been in more or less continuous conflict for centuries. The Dornish marches had been fought over so many times that the lords there had stopped counting the wars and simply assumed the next one was coming. The Iron Islands had held the Riverlands by force for decades, a yoke that every river lord resented in their bones. Westeros was not a continent at peace that Aegon disturbed. It was a continent that had been wearing itself down with its own internal quarrels since before anyone's grandfather was born. What Aegon offered, what he represented, even if his method of representing it was fire, was the end of that particular exhaustion. A single ruler would end the endless wars between the Reach and the Rock. The Riverlands would no longer be a prize seized and held by the Iron Islands through force. And the energy the great lords had once spent fighting each other could, at least in theory, be turned toward something else. Some of the lords understood this. Some did not need to understand it consciously to feel the appeal. Aegon understood it clearly, and he used it. Aegon understood something that the kings of Westeros did not yet grasp. Numbers mattered, armies mattered, castles mattered. But all of those things had been built in a world without the fire that ruled his bloodline. Their walls had never been tested against Balerion. Their formations had never tried to hold against Vhagar and Meraxes striking from above. Their experience of war was entirely horizontal. It moved across the ground. It followed the old rules of cavalry and spear and siege. Aegon was about to introduce them to a different set of rules entirely. Rules written in flame. But the conquest was not simply a matter of superior firepower. That interpretation flatters neither Aegon nor the kings he faced. Something more was at work in him. Something that drove him not merely to dominate but to unify. He was not looking for tribute. He was not building an empire that would drain these kingdoms dry for the benefit of Dragonstone. He seemed to want something rarer and harder. One realm, one king, one purpose. To understand why, you have to go back to the island where he was born. Dragonstone was not a comfortable seat of power. It was a volcanic island off the eastern coast of Westeros, shaped by ancient fire, its stone carved into the forms of dragons by Valyrian craftsmen who had brought their sorcerous art across the narrow sea. Its walls were dark, its towers were cold. The sea around it was often rough, and the wind coming off the water had a quality that got into the bones. It was not the kind of place that invited pleasure. It was the kind of place that hardened you. The Targaryens had held it for nearly a century before Aegon was born. They were not the lords of anything grand. They were not the powers of Westeros. They were dragon lords of the old Valyrian blood, who had escaped the doom by what some called foresight and others called fortune. Aegon Targaryen had sold his holdings in Valyria and sailed west 12 years before the doom destroyed everything. His daughter Daenerys had dreamed it. She had seen the mountain split and the fire come down, and she had told her father, and her father, unlike the other great lords of Valyria, had listened. That decision made the Targaryens unique in the world. They were the only Dragonlord family to survive. Everywhere else, the blood that could ride and bond with dragons had been consumed in the doom. The other great houses, the ones who had laughed at Aegon for fleeing, were ash and bone somewhere beneath the smoking sea. The Targaryens were exiles, but they were exiles with dragons. And in the century of blood that followed the doom, as the free cities fought over Valyria's ruins and the Dothraki swept across the eastern plains, those dragons meant survival. By the time Aegon came of age and turned his eyes west, 3 dragons stood ready for the crossing. Balerion was the eldest. He had come west with Aegon, a young dragon then, who would grow over the following century into something that made men question the nature of the world. His wingspan could swallow the shadow of a castle. His flame was black at the core and red at its edge, and things touched by it did not merely burn. They ceased to exist as solid objects. They became liquid. Then they became nothing. Sailors who glimpsed Balerion from the sea sometimes turned their ships around without knowing why. Instinct spoke before reason could stop it. Vhagar was smaller and younger. She had been born on Dragonstone, her egg having hatched in the volcanic heat of the island's underground passages. She was bonded to Aegon's sister wife Visenya, a woman as hard and precise as the Valyrian steel blade she carried, a warrior who had trained seriously in the way that noble women of that era rarely did. Visenya was not performing martial skill for appearances. She was cultivating it as a genuine capability, and it showed in how she moved, how she thought, how she later fought. Meraxes was the third, bonded to Aegon's other sister wife, Rhaenys. Where Visenya was cold and measured, Rhaenys was warm and curious, given to pleasure and laughter and the softer arts of persuasion. The 2 sisters could not have been more different in temperament. Both would prove essential to what came next. Aegon himself rode Balerion, and the bond between man and dragon was something that observers noted had its own quality beyond simple control. Riders directed their mounts, yes, but Balerion was not an instrument being played. He was a force of nature that had agreed, in whatever way ancient creatures agree to things, to carry Aegon where Aegon needed to go. The relationship between them was closer to alliance than ownership. Aegon had grown up on Dragonstone watching the continent of Westeros to the west. He would have known its geography by heart before he ever set foot there. He would have known the names of the kingdoms and the houses and the rivers and the mountain passes. He would have studied it the way you study a thing you intend to possess one day, carefully, thoroughly, without announcement. What drove him to act when he did is one of the most interesting questions of the age. He was young when the Conquest began. He was not reacting to a threat. Westeros had not attacked Dragonstone. No great coalition of Westerosi kings had assembled to push the Targaryens into the sea. He chose to cross. He chose the moment. He chose to come with his sisters and his dragons and a relatively modest force of fighting men and make a claim over an entire continent that had never acknowledged his house as anything. And the dream, that is the detail the records preserve, fragmented as they are. Aegon had dragon dreams. That gift had run in his blood since Daenerys the Dreamer had saved the family a century before. Dragon dreams were not comfortable, pleasant visions. They were vivid and pressing, and they carried a weight that ordinary sleep did not. They felt like memory rather than imagination. They felt true. What Aegon saw in his dream, what he later called the Song of Ice and Fire, was a long winter coming from the north, a darkness that moved and killed, a cold that would not stop at castle walls or at armies or at anything men had built to hold back ordinary threats. And in the dream, the only thing that stood against it was a Targaryen on the Iron Throne, a united Westeros under a single ruler with the will and the fire to hold the line. He told his sisters. Both of them took it seriously. This was a family that understood prophetic dreams were not to be dismissed, and so the purpose beneath the conquest was not merely power. It was a duty Aegon believed he had been shown, a reason larger than the accumulation of lordship. He was not coming to Westeros because he wanted a throne. He was coming because he believed the realm needed one. Not his throne precisely. A throne for the realm itself. Something to anchor the continent together when the great cold came again. Whether he was right is a question that the centuries would slowly answer. What matters here is that he believed it. And belief, in a man with 3 dragons, is not a small thing. The preparations at Dragonstone were not secret, precisely, but they were not announced either. Aegon had sent ravens across Westeros before the crossing. He had written to every king and lord of consequence, informing them of his intention to unite the continent under one crown. His tone, by all accounts, was not the tone of a man issuing ultimatums. It was the tone of a man who considered the matter already settled and who was extending the courtesy of advance notice. This tone was itself a kind of intelligence. It told the kings of Westeros something about how Aegon thought. He was not making an offer that could be negotiated down. He was not the emissary of a foreign power looking for favorable terms. He was announcing a reality that he intended to create, and he was giving the great houses the opportunity to step into that reality with their dignity intact, rather than be dragged into it bleeding. Some understood the message. Most did not, or chose not to. Argilac of the Stormlands sent back Aegon's envoy, mutilated, hands taken at the wrists. It was a statement that required no translation. Harren the Black sent no reply at all. He was, by this point, just completing Harrenhal after 40 years of construction. He had spent his entire reign building that castle. He believed it would make him invincible. The silence from Dragonstone may have seemed to him like a distant irrelevance, something happening east of his attention. The Vale's regent Shara Arryn proposed a marriage. She offered herself or her daughter in exchange for an alliance. Aegon declined. He was already married to both his sisters and found the Westerosi one-wife custom quaint, rather than binding, but he had no interest in alliances. He was not seeking partners in his venture. He was seeking fealty. That refusal reveals something about the nature of the conquest before the first fire was lit. Aegon was not a man who wanted allies of equal standing. An alliance implies mutual obligation, mutual constraint. You grant your allies something in exchange for their help, and then you owe them. Aegon was not building a coalition. He was building a kingdom where the power ran downward from a single point. The great lords would keep their lands, their castles, their armies, but they would keep them as subordinates, not as partners. He was not offering partnership. He was offering survival with dignity or destruction without it. The kings who chose the first option would find their families continuing for centuries. The kings who chose the second would find their lines ending in fire. Aegon crossed the narrow sea in what is recorded as the year 2 BC by some accounts, though the exact dating remains debated. He brought with him a modest army, perhaps 1,500 fighting men at the initial crossing, with reinforcements to follow from loyal houses. This number surprises people when they first encounter it. 1,500 men to conquer a continent held by kings who could field tens of thousands. But this misunderstands the nature of what Aegon was doing. He was not conquering through numbers. He was conquering through terror and through the recognition terror produced. That no army of any size could resist the dragons that flew above his column. The 1,500 men were not the weapon. They were the demonstration that Aegon did not need more. Every lord who watched that small force march and survive did the mathematics of what would happen if they raised their own banners against it. The dragons made numbers largely irrelevant. Not completely irrelevant. There were limits to what even 3 dragons could achieve, as Dawn would later teach him. But against armies in the open field, against stone castles, against anything that could be surrounded and burned, the dragons were decisive. They collapsed the old calculations entirely. The psychology of that collapse deserves a moment. The lords of Westeros were not cowards. They were men who had spent their whole lives inside systems of power built on recognizable terms. Armies met armies. Sieges followed established logic. Castles fell to patience and starvation, or to treachery from within. The language of war was something they spoke fluently. Their grandfathers had fought in it. Their fathers had refined it. They knew its rhythms. Aegon arrived speaking a language none of them had heard in living memory. The last dragons over Westeros had been Valyrian, and that was before the Doom, before the Century of Blood, before the living memory of anyone breathing when Balerian's shadow crossed the coast. There were records, yes. There were stories told by old maesters about the size and terror of Dragonflame. But records are not the same as experience. You can read every account of a storm that ever swept a coast and still be unprepared for the actual wind when it comes. The lords of Westeros had read the records. They had not lived through the wind. This gap between knowledge and experience was precisely what Aegon crossed toward. Not a gap in their courage, but in their reference points. They could not calibrate how to respond to something their entire military tradition had not anticipated. The smart ones recalibrated quickly. The proud ones recalibrated slowly and paid a higher price. The very proud ones did not recalibrate at all and ceased to exist as royal lines. Aegon made landfall at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where the river met the sea on the western shore. The land there was nothing remarkable. A rocky promontory, 2 hills, good harbour access. He built a wooden fort on the high ground, a practical shelter, not a symbol, at least not yet. The small folk of the surrounding area came to look. Some came to trade. A few came to swear service. Word spread quickly, as word always does when something unprecedented arrives. To the south, Argilac the Arrogant began to think more carefully than his earlier gesture suggested. He reached out. Not to Aegon, his pride would not allow that, but to Harren the Black. He proposed an alliance between the Stormlands and the Iron Islands, a combined force to push this silver-haired stranger back into the sea before he could take root. Harren declined, not because he was unafraid, but because Harrenhal was finished. He was untouchable, he believed, behind those walls. The Island King did not fear a man with 3 dragons because he had never truly imagined what 3 dragons meant in practice. He had heard descriptions, surely. He had received Aegon's letter. But there is a gap between hearing a description of something and truly understanding it, and Harren had lived his entire life in a world where the rules of war were familiar. Thick walls held against any assault. High towers repelled siege engines. Stone castles were the final word in warfare. He did not know, yet, that stone melts. Meanwhile, to the south, Aegon's sister wife Rhaenys had flown Meraxes to the Stormlands on her own mission. She offered terms to the Storm King's bannermen. Lords who came to Aegon's side would keep their lands. Lords who chose Argilac would share his fate. One by one, the Durrandon vassals began to make their choices. Some defected immediately. Others waited to see what happened next. Argilac marched to meet Aegon without his full strength because of those defections. His stubbornness had already cost him part of his army before the battle even began. The 2 forces met in what men would afterward call the Last Storm, fought in driving rain in the fields south of the Blackwater. Aegon's commander on the ground that night was his master of war, a man of considerable skill and ambition. The Storm King fought himself, which was honourable and also fatal. He was cut down in single combat. His death broke what remained of Stormland's resistance. There is something in the manner of Argilac's end that tells you who he was. He did not send a champion. He did not retreat when his flanks crumbled. He rode to the front of his lines in a driving storm, in the dark, and fought personally against an enemy who had no reason to give him the formal duel he was seeking. He was a man of the old order, the order where a king proved himself with steel, where personal valor on the field meant something about the rightness of a cause. That world was not gone. Aegon's conquest had not changed what it meant to be brave, but bravery alone could not answer what Aegon had brought. Argilac died honorably, in the rain, fighting to the last. His kingdom outlasted him by about a week, and the conquest had truly begun. Harren the Black had ruled the Riverlands for 40 years, and in those 40 years he had become the kind of lord whom hatred makes legendary. He had come to the rivers through conquest, his Iron Island ancestors having pushed east across the water and taken what the River Lords could not defend. The River Lords had never loved Hoare rule. It was extraction without mercy, taxes stripped to the bone, labor demanded without compensation, petitions dismissed or punished. For decades, the people of the Riverlands had endured because there was nothing else to do. The Iron Islands held the rivers with a fist that did not open. Harrenhal was the monument to that fist. 40 years. That is how long Harren had spent building it. He had pulled materials from across the Riverlands, had demanded stone and timber and labor from every lord beneath him. Men had died quarrying the rock. Men had died hauling it. Men had died raising the towers. The stories said Harren had used the blood of his enemies in the mortar, which is probably not literally true, but speaks to how his people thought of what he had made. It was not a home. It was a statement. It said, I am permanent. I am beyond reach. I cannot be touched. 5 towers, each one taller than anything else in Westeros. Walls that a charging Destria could barely see the top of. Gatehouses thick enough to hold entire garrisons. A great hall that could seat an army. Harrenhal was the largest castle ever built in Westeros, and it had been finished, just barely, by the time Aegon crossed the narrow sea. The irony was precise. Harren finished his masterwork just in time to die inside it. When news of Aegon's landing reached Harrenhal, Harren made his choice. He would hold the castle. His army would shelter behind those walls. Let Aegon and his dragons come. Stone could not burn. Stone could not fly. Stone was patient and permanent, and Harren would sit inside his stone until the Dragon Lord wore himself out or ran out of provisions or was killed by one of the dozens of enemies surely forming against him. The River Lords did not share this confidence. Many of them had already had enough of Hoare rule without needing any particular invitation to abandon it. When word came that Aegon was marching north from the mouth of the Blackwater, the Lord of House Tully made a decision that would define his house's standing for the next 3 centuries. He opened his gates. He offered men. He accepted the Targaryen as his king. Other river lords followed. The iron-born chain around the Riverlands snapped link by link as the column moved north. Aegon arrived before Harrenhal as the sun was going down. He sent terms. Harren could surrender, yield the castle, bend the knee. His life would be spared. His sons might keep some portion of their status. The Conquest was not interested in pointless destruction where a yielded gate would serve. Harren sent back refusal. What happened next is the moment that changed how every lord in Westeros understood the nature of the threat they faced. Aegon mounted Balerion as the darkness came on. The black dread rose from the ground with a wing beat that men could feel in their chests from a quarter-mile away. He circled once. The watchers on the walls of Harrenhal would have heard him before they saw him properly. That sound, vast and rhythmic, coming out of the darkening sky. And then the fire came down. Not onto the walls, where it might have been weathered, or at least survived in some diluted form. Balerion directed his flame into the towers themselves, into the stone. Stone does not burn like wood. It does not catch and consume. But under sufficient heat it softens. It flows. The mortar between the great blocks became liquid. The stones themselves began to warp and buckle. The towers that Harren had raised to be eternal began to melt from the inside out, the heat having nowhere to escape, building within the walls until the interior was a furnace. Harren the Black was inside the highest tower with his sons when it happened. The details of his end are mercifully obscure in the records. The tower sealed itself around them. What the fire did not consume, the collapsed stone did. The great hall burned. The The gatehouses cracked. By morning, Harrenhal was a ruin. Not a rubble pile, not a level plain, but something stranger than either. The towers were still standing, more or less, but twisted, warped, fused into shapes that no mason had intended. The stone had wept, people said afterward. It had melted and then hardened again in new forms. Harrenhal still stands, generations later. It always will. Stone does not return to what it was. What Balerion did to Harrenhal that night was understood immediately for what it was. Not merely a military victory, a demonstration. Every castle in Westeros was suddenly open to question. All those lords who had looked at their walls and felt secure, who had thought, as Harren had thought, that enough stone and enough height would protect them from anything, had to revise that feeling. The walls would still hold against swords and siege engines and anything a man on foot or horseback could bring against them. But the walls were not proof against what Aegon had brought. The River Lords understood this. The Lords of the Reach and the Rock, receiving the news by Raven, began to understand it too. The question was not whether they could stop Aegon in the open field, because the field was already clearly lost. The question was whether stone would save them. The answer, written in the ruined towers of Harrenhal, was no. But understanding a lesson and accepting its consequences are different things. The great lords of the Reach and the Rock were proud men, with proud histories. King Mern Gardner and King Loren Lannister looked at each other across the political landscape and made a decision that, in retrospect, was the only decision their pride allowed them to make. They would combine their armies and meet Aegon in the open field. 55,000 men, the largest army assembled in generations. Surely that many swords and spears, that much cavalry, that much weight of human effort, would be enough to overwhelm even 3 dragons. The army that King Mern and King Loren assembled was genuinely impressive. 55,000 fighting men, give or take. Cavalry from the Reach, the finest horse on the continent. The Knights of Highgarden trained since boyhood for the kind of thundering charge that had won wars for 300 years. The infantry of the Westerlands, steady and well armed. The gold of Casterly Rock having purchased both equipment and training of real quality. Crossbowmen, light cavalry, a reserve of men-at-arms, kept back to seal any gap that opened. The combined host of 2 of Westeros's most powerful kingdoms, fielded together under 2 living kings, who had both survived wars of their own. It was, in every conventional sense, more than enough to destroy the force Aegon had brought. That was the wager both kings had made. And by the ordinary rules of warfare, the wager was sound. Even with 3 dragons in support, Aegon's ground forces were vastly outnumbered. If the combined army could force a battle in close terrain, if they could get their cavalry past the flanks, if they could disrupt the battle line before the dragons had space to work, it was possible, in theory, to win. Theory and practice diverged on a summer evening in the fields of the Reach. Somewhere between Golden Grove and Stonebridge, in the open grasslands that spread wide and flat for miles in every direction. There was nothing to hide behind, no terrain advantage, just open ground and sky. Aegon had chosen the ground, or rather, Aegon had been chosen by the ground. This was exactly the kind of terrain where his advantage could express itself fully. Open space for the dragons to move, no obstacles that might break their attack, and the grass was dry. The battle opened in the traditional fashion. Cavalry on the wings, infantry in the center, both sides moving to close the distance and let the fighting begin. On the ground, the numbers told. Aegon's host was pressed back almost immediately. More men meant more pressure. The lines bent, and then Aegon lifted his hand, and all 3 dragons entered the battle together. Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes swept low over the combined army from 3 directions simultaneously, and they did not breathe fire onto empty ground to frighten horses. They breathed fire onto the formations themselves. The field became a different thing. Fire ran through the dry grass and moved with the speed that grass fire always has. Faster than a running man, unpredictable in its direction, swallowing the spaces between formations and cutting off retreat before soldiers understood what was happening. The cavalry, whose horses had instincts older than any training, broke. They turned. They scattered. Riders who could not control their mounts were carried away from the battle by animals trying to survive. The infantry had nowhere to go. What happened in those central formations is not fully described in any source that survives, and there is mercy in that silence. 4,000 men died by fire that day. Many more were killed in the general rout, as panicking soldiers ran into each other and into the flames. The field afterward was black earth and ash. The grass burned down to nothing, the mark of Balerion's passage visible for weeks in the scorched ground. Kingman Gardner died in the fire. His death was the end of House Gardner, a royal line that had ruled the Reach since the age of heroes, stretching back beyond memory. They were simply gone. The last king of the Reach, consumed by the same fire that consumed his army, his dynasty ending not with a siege or a succession crisis or a treachery, but with a single terrible evening. King Loren Lannister survived. He had the instincts of a practical man, and those instincts saved him. He saw what the fire was doing, and he fled before the rout became complete. He rode west with what remained of his personal guard and kept riding. Whatever conviction had brought him to this field was still somewhere in him, but it was now in competition with a clear-eyed reading of what had just happened. He had been present at something that no army of any size could overcome. He knew it. Loren came to terms 4 days after the battle. He knelt. He surrendered his crown. He pledged his house to the Iron Throne and was permitted to keep Casterly Rock, his lands, his position, his dignity. Reduced, yes, but surviving. The Lannisters of the Rock would endure precisely because Loren made this calculation quickly and cleanly, before pride could talk him into further resistance that the burned field had already answered. The Field of Fire, as it came to be called, was the last time the 3 dragons of the Conquest flew together in battle. It was also the last time any Westerosi king seriously tried to defeat Aegon through weight of numbers in an open battle. The lesson was too expensive to repeat. The lesson wrote itself in ash across the Reach and was read by every lord from the Stormlands to the Wall. 55,000 men had not been enough. Nothing that any lord in Westeros could raise would be enough. That question was answered. What remained now was the question of how to yield, with grace, and keep what could be kept, or without grace, and lose everything. The Reach lost its king, but not its identity. Harlan Tyrell, steward to the Gardeners, had held High Garden against a Targaryen host that had bypassed it during the battle. He yielded the castle without a fight when Aegon turned back south, and in exchange was granted lordship over the Reach in the Gardener's place. This was not a small thing. The Tyrells had been stewards, capable men in service to a greater house. In a single exchange, they became the greatest house of the South. The Gardeners had bled themselves trying to hold power, The Tyrells had the patience to wait for power to be offered. The contrast is not subtle. Either way, the Field of Fire had secured the south for Aegon, and the conquest was surely soon to end. The conquest moved at different speeds in different places, and the variation teaches its own lessons. In the Stormlands, the matter had largely been settled by the last storm, where Argilac the Arrogant had died in the rain. His daughter Argella had tried briefly to continue resistance. She barricaded herself in Storm's End and declared herself the new Storm Queen. Her garrison had other ideas. They handed her over to Aegon's forces before any siege could begin. Bound in chains, stripped, delivered to the door of the Targaryen camp in what must have been one of the more humiliating moments in Westerosi history. Aegon reportedly treated her with respect, covered her, and sent her inside properly. He had no interest in degrading the defeated. He wanted a lord in the Stormlands, not a monument to cruelty. The practical solution was before him. He gave them Orys Baratheon. Orys was one of Aegon's most trusted commanders, a man of military talent and genuine loyalty, whose origins were quietly noted by those who cared about such things. There was a persistent rumor that Orys was Aegon's bastard half-brother. Whether true or not, Aegon treated him as family, and the gift of the Stormlands was not merely practical appointment, it was personal trust. Orys took Argella to wife, took the Durrandon sigil, the stag, and their words, and founded the line of House Baratheon. He kept what the old house had been, as far as symbolism could carry it, while planting new blood at the root. This pattern, old power preserved in new hands where practical, repeated itself across the conquest. Aegon did not want a continent of ruins and resentments. He wanted a realm that functioned. That meant leaving lords in place wherever they could be left, binding them with oaths rather than chains, giving them reason to be invested in his success rather than quietly nursing their defeat. The Vale was more complex. Shara Arryn had written to Aegon before the crossing. She had written after the crossing. She had continued writing as the conquest moved through the Riverlands and the south, watching her kingdom remain untouched while the world changed around it. Her son was young. The Eyrie was high. She calculated, and the calculation kept suggesting that she might outlast the thing if she was patient enough. She sent ravens to the north, to the remaining resistant lords, searching for an alliance that would give her the weight to push back. None formed. The pieces that might have joined such an alliance had already been dealt with. Visenya flew Vhagar through the mountain passes and appeared above the Eyrie without warning. The Eyrie in those days, as now, had no conventional approach for an army. The mountain paths were narrow, the keep itself perched at such an elevation that siege engines could not be brought to bear. The mountain clans haunted the lower passes. It was, in traditional military terms, unassailable. Vhagar settled on a tower of the Eyrie itself. Young Ronal Arryn saw her from his mother's arms and was, by all accounts, completely enchanted. He was a small boy confronted with something that had escaped the world of stories and landed on his house. He asked, reportedly, if he could ride the dragon. That small question changed everything. Whether Visenya promised him a ride, or simply understood that the child's wonder was the key she needed. The negotiations moved quickly after that. Shara Arryn, faced with a dragon on the tower and a son who wanted nothing more than to be allowed near it, accepted terms. The Vale would bend the knee. The Arryns would keep their seat and their dignity. Ronal got his ride, or so the story says. circling above the vale on Vhagar with the wind in his hair. The small lord of an ancient house that had just become something different. Shara Arryn was a practical woman who loved her son. She had done everything she could to find a way to keep her position without yielding. When yielding became the only option that kept the boy alive and the house intact, she yielded cleanly. There is no shame in that reading, whatever the gossip of later court suggested. In the north, the reckoning carried a different weight entirely. Torrhen Stark, King of Winter, had been watching the conquest from behind the neck. He had the benefit of distance and time to think. He had seen what happened at Harrenhal. He had heard about the Field of Fire. He had received the ravens that circled back and forth across the continent as lords signalled their submissions. By the time Aegon turned his attention northward, the picture was complete. Torrhen called his banners. He marched south with 30,000 Northmen. That army was real. It was the full strength of the north. Hardened men from a hard land, not levies pressed unwillingly, but soldiers who had trained their whole lives for the wars the north demanded. They reached the Trident and stopped. Across the river, Aegon's host waited, and above the host, all three dragons circled. Torrhen sent his Maester south to take stock of what was across the water. The Maester came back and spoke plainly. The numbers were manageable, the terrain was favourable, but the dragons were not part of any reckoning that ended well. Torrhen sat with that information through the night. He was not a coward. No Stark who marched 30,000 men to the Trident was a coward. He was a man who understood the difference between courage and futility. Charging into the Field of Fire would have been courage of a kind. It would also have been the end of the North's army, the end of the North's capacity to defend itself, and possibly the end of Winterfell itself if Balerion turned north in answer to the battle. He knelt. He crossed the river and knelt before Aegon and surrendered his crown. He kept everything else: his castle, his lands, his family, his wardenship of the North. The North remained the North in every way that mattered. Its culture, its customs, its old gods, its ancient ways. What changed was a single political fact. Torrhen was no longer a king. He was a Lord Paramount. History gave him the name the King Who Knelt, and delivered it with an ambiguity that has never quite settled. Some say it with scorn, some say it with respect. The Starks themselves, 3 centuries later, still held the North. The Gardeners had not survived their pride. The calculus is not complicated. One house that would not bend survived. One house that burned its army trying to hold its crown did not. The North remembered. That, in its way, was the lesson the Starks took from Torrhen's mourning by the Trident. Rhaenys was the warmth of the conquest. Aegon was its will, but Visenya was its edge. She is the sister wife who gets the least comfortable legacy in the telling, partly because she was the least comfortable person in the doing. Rhaenys charmed. Aegon commanded. Visenya compelled. There is a difference, and it shows in the work she did across the years of the conquest. Much of it away from the great battles, in the quieter and harder work of bringing the stubborn corners of the map into line. She had trained as a warrior since she was young, not the ceremonial training that great ladies sometimes took up for appearances, the kind that results in graceful posture and nothing useful. Visenya had trained because she intended to use it. She carried a Valyrian steel blade called Dark Sister, a weapon made for a smaller hand than the usual warrior's grip, quick and precise, rather than heavy. She wore armor in the field. She led men personally, and she was bonded to Vhagar, the second largest of the 3 dragons at the Conquest opening, a mount whose temperament matched her riders, patient, territorial, and not particularly interested in being tested. The campaign that defines Visenya's independent role in the Conquest is Crackclaw Point. Crackclaw Point was a peninsula jutting into the Eastern Sea north of King's Landing, a wild and wooded place whose lords had long kept their own counsel. The people of Crackclaw were old First Men blood, stubborn and independent, sitting at the edge of the map in a way that made great houses overlook them until they needed something. They had their own customs. They answered to distant powers who rarely sent help when Crackclaw's coast demanded it. Whatever allegiances had been pressed on them over the years, they wore lightly. Visenya flew to them herself. She did not send an emissary. She did not issue terms by raven or demand fealty through intermediaries. She came in person, on Vhagar, and she met with the lords of Crackclaw directly. What she offered them was not what Aegon offered the great lords. She offered something more personal. The lords of Crackclaw Point, if they swore to Aegon, would swear directly to the crown, not to any intermediary lord paramount, not to any regional power that might use their oath as a leash. They would be the king's men. Their old grievances against distant masters would be resolved at a stroke. They swore to her on the spot. The lords of Crackclaw Point knelt to Visenya Targaryen individually, each man coming forward in turn, and swore fealty directly to House Targaryen. That form of swearing, bypassing the Lord Paramount entirely and pledging directly to the crown, was unusual. It was also exactly what those lords had been waiting for. Someone to recognize that their loyalty was worth having on its own terms, not as an extension of some greater house's claim. Visenya understood something about the geography of loyalty that the grand military campaigns obscured. Not every lord needed to be threatened into line. Some needed to be shown that swearing to the right master was an improvement on their current situation. The lords of Crackclaw had little to gain from the old arrangement, and something real to gain from a direct bond with the Iron Throne. Visenya read that, and she used it. This was not isolated to Crackclaw. Throughout the Conquest, while Aegon was managing the grand strategic picture and Rhaenys was flying south and charming lords into seeing reason, Visenya was working the harder cases. The lords who were too proud for easy persuasion and not quite committed enough to open defiance. The border regions where allegiances had always been complicated. The pockets of resistance that the main armies bypassed in their haste to reach the next great battle. She was also the one who stayed alert when the others did not. The assassination attempt on Aegon, the one that nearly succeeded, the night when Dornish agents reached his chambers, was stopped by Visenya. The records are not entirely consistent on the details, but the shape of the story is clear enough. Aegon had guards. The guards had been either bribed or killed or bypassed. Men were in the room, or very nearly in the room, who intended to end the king. Visenya was there. Her blade was faster. The men were not alive when the disturbance was over. There is a portrait of Visenya that later generations found easiest. The harsh one, the cold one. The sister wife who was more weapon than woman and less loved for it. That portrait is not entirely unfair. She was hard. She did not soften easily. She did not charm where she could compel. But the portrait misses something important. She kept Aegon alive. That is not a small thing. The Conquest required all 3 of them. Rhaenys to open doors, Aegon to walk through them with the weight of Balerion behind him, and Visenya to make sure none of it was undone from the inside. The Dornish understood that assassinating a dragon rider was one viable answer to dragon riders. Visenya was the reason that answer failed, at least once, when it might otherwise have succeeded. She outlived both of her companions. Rhaenys died in Dorne. Aegon died at Dragonstone. Visenya lived on into the reign of their son Aenys, and then into the reign of the king she herself brought about, Maegor, her own son by Aegon, whose claim to the throne she pressed after Aenys died, and whose brutal reign she lived to see established, if not to see concluded. She was to the end the cold blade, the edge that held when everything else was in motion. The Conquest would have looked very different without her. It might not have held together at all, before the Ravens, before the Crossing, before any of the great events that history has made famous. There was a room on Dragonstone, and a table inside it, and a man bent over that table planning something that had never been done. The painted table is one of the stranger artifacts of the Conquest period, and one of the most revealing. Aegon had it made before he crossed. It was enormous, the length of a great hall, carved and painted to represent the continent of Westeros in meticulous detail. Every kingdom, every great house's seat, every river and mountain range and forest and road. The coastlines were accurate to a degree that suggested real information had gone into them, not guesswork. Someone had gathered intelligence carefully over a long time and rendered it in paint and carved wood on a surface large enough to walk around. This was not the work of a man acting on impulse. Impulsive men do not commission detailed maps. They do not spend years studying the geography of a continent they intend to claim. They do not mark positions and trace routes and think through the sequence of engagements in advance. Aegon had been planning the conquest for a long time before anyone else knew it was coming. The painted table told you something about how he thought. He did not fight from instinct, or not only from instinct. He thought in terms of geography, of movement, of the relationship between castles and rivers and the roads that connected them. He understood that a campaign was a sequence of decisions made in advance about where to apply pressure and in what order, and that the sequence mattered as much as the individual engagements. The great lords who had laughed at dragon lords playing at war had never seen a conqueror who studied the map this carefully. When Aegon crossed, he did not do so alone in any sense of the word. There were houses that came to him before the first battle, before the first dragon dropped fire on anything. Lords who had decided, for reasons of their own, that the Targaryen cause was worth backing before it was proven. House Massey was one such house. They held a small seat at Stone Dance on the eastern shore of Blackwater Bay, close enough to Dragonstone that they had lived for a century in the shadow of the Targaryens. They knew the family. They had interacted with the household. When Aegon crossed the narrow water of the bay to the mainland, House Massey was among the first to declare for him. House Eltiger of Claw Isle was another, an old Valyrian house, one of the handful of houses in Westeros with genuine Valyrian blood in their ancestry, even if they had been settled in Westeros for generations. Their Valyrian heritage made the Targaryen cause feel less foreign than it might have felt to houses with no connection to the old world across the sea. They brought ships. Ships mattered for supply lines across the bay, for moving men, for keeping the beachhead viable in those first weeks. These early allies did not fight at Harrenhal or the Field of Fire. They were not the names that fill out the great stories of the conquest, but they were present for the harder and less celebrated work, the logistics of keeping an army fed and supplied and moving across a continent, the administrative work of governing the territory that fell to Aegon as each new region submitted, the signalling to other undecided lords that the Targaryen enterprise had backing beyond just 3 dragons and a dream. Every early backer made it slightly easier for the next backer to commit. Commitment is contagious that way. A lord watching from the sidelines sees one house of good standing join the cause and has one fewer excuse to wait. 2 houses join and the picture shifts. 5 houses, and the question is no longer whether Aegon can be taken seriously. It is whether you can afford to be on the wrong side when he wins. The painted table sat at the center of all of this. Aegon returned to it throughout the Conquest, or so the accounts suggest, not only for the initial planning, but for the ongoing management of a campaign that required constant adjustment. The Field of Fire had not been planned down to its last blade of grass. No battle is, but the general shape of where to apply pressure, which houses to approach, and in what order, where to allow resistance to exhaust itself, and where to strike before it hardened. That thinking lived on the painted table. After the conquest was over and the kingdom was settled, the painted table stayed at Dragonstone. It did not move to King's Landing. Aegon left it on the island, in the room where it had always been, as if the campaign was still ongoing somewhere in the back of his mind, and the table needed to be ready. That room became, over generations, something between a war room and a shrine. Later Targaryen kings came to Dragonstone and stood over that table and looked at the map of the continent their ancestor had made. Some came to plan. Some came to remember. Some came simply to look at what 7 kingdoms looked like rendered in paint and wood, and to understand, or fail to understand, what it had cost to make the painted version real. The table outlasted the conquest by centuries. It outlasted the dragons. It outlasted most of the houses whose seats were marked on its surface. It is, in its way, as honest a monument as the Iron Throne. Aegon built his city on the same 2 hills where he had built his first wooden fort. Aegon's high hill became the seat of the Red Keep, though the keep itself would take years to complete. The other hill, across the ridge, would hold the sept. Between them, the city grew from a trading settlement into something that aspired to permanence. It was called King's Landing, a name that captured the simplicity of its origin. This was where the conqueror had landed, and so this was where the crown would sit. Cities are strange things. They do not decide to be great. They grow toward greatness through accidents of geography and commerce, and the decisions of men who happen to choose them as centers of power. King's Landing had the Blackwater rush for trade. It had a natural harbour. It sat roughly in the middle of the continent, accessible from the Reach and the Riverlands and the Stormlands. Aegon could have built his seat elsewhere. Dragonstone would have been the obvious choice, the ancestral home with its dark volcanic stone and its defensive position. He chose not to. The conquest was of Westeros, not Dragonstone. The throne would sit in the middle of what had been conquered. The throne itself is one of the stranger objects in the history of the realm. Aegon commanded that the swords of his fallen enemies be melted down and forged together, not kept as trophies, not displayed on walls. Melted, fused, shaped into a seat by Balerion's own flame. The dragon fire ran through the metal and fused it into something that was not quite sculpture and not quite furniture. A mass of blades and sword points and molten steel that hardened into a jagged, asymmetrical seat that no craftsman would have designed for comfort. A king, Aegon reportedly said, should never sit at ease. The throne was sharp. It cut. Sitting on the Iron Throne in the full dragon-forged swords required constant care and attention, or the blades would draw blood. This was not a flaw to be corrected. It was a philosophy made physical. Power demanded attention. Power was not comfortable. Power that felt comfortable was power about to make a mistake. Aegon sat on it anyway, for years, and it cut him as it cut all who followed. A sept rose on the opposite hill in those early years. It would not be the grand structure that later generations would raise. That came later, under other hands and other kings. What Aegon built was a place of worship that signaled intent, that the new seat of power would hold the faith at its heart. This was another kind of decision that went beyond politics. The faith of the Seven was the dominant religion of southern Westeros. The Andals had brought it across the narrow sea thousands of years before, and it had spread through the south, while the north kept its old gods in their weirwood groves. The High Septon at Oldtown was the spiritual head of this faith, and his authority over the hearts of the southern smallfolk was not trivial. Great lords could be conquered by fire. Small folk could not be conquered in the same way. You could burn their homes, but you could not force belief, and a realm built on ash was not a stable realm. Aegon understood this. He did not impose the faith. He did not declare himself a god or a prophet. He let the faith continue as it was. Let the Septons preach. Let the lords build their septs. Let the rituals continue unchanged. And he built his city with a great sept at its heart, a visible statement that the new power over Westeros was not hostile to the religion that held its people's souls. The High Septon at Oldtown had been, before the Conquest, in a position of genuine anxiety. Oldtown was the oldest city in Westeros, a trading port of ancient pedigree, the seat of the citadel and its maesters, home to the Hightowers, who had long been among the most powerful lords of the Reach. The Hightowers had managed Oldtown through the Conquest period with exceptional care. They had sent no armies against Aegon. They had made no great pledges to the gardeners before the Field of Fire. When Rhaenys flew Meraxes to the city and landed in the plaza outside the Starry Sept, the Lord Hightower opened the gates of the city himself. The High Septon emerged. He was an old man, by accounts, walking in his ceremonial robes, and he anointed Aegon rather than condemning him. This was the moment the Conquest became a faith as much as a military campaign. Not because Aegon claimed divine authority, he did not, particularly, but because the highest religious figure in the Southern Realm had recognized him, had placed the blessing of the Seven on this man and his conquest, had said, implicitly, that this was not an act of destruction, but an act that the order of the world could accommodate. That anointing mattered enormously to the small folk. Lords bowed to power. Small folk needed something that felt like rightness, like ordained order, like the world settling into a pattern that made sense. The High Septon's blessing was not the same as the military victories. It was deeper. It reached into hearths and conversations, and the quiet daily decisions of common people about whether to accept or resist the new order that had arrived. And with Oldtown and the faith won over, the map of Westeros was nearly complete. Nearly. Dawn had not submitted. Dawn had not burned. Dawn had watched all of this from its dry southern expanse and reached a different answer than everyone else. Princess Meria Martell was old and blind and enormously large, and she was perhaps the shrewdest ruler in Westeros at the moment of the Conquest. She had ruled Dawn for decades. She had watched kingdoms rise and fall, had watched the Reach and the Stormlands expand and contract, had maintained Dornish independence through a combination of terrain, willingness to strike back hard at any provocation, and the simple geographical fact that Dorne was very difficult to hold even when you could take it. Dorne was a land of deserts and mountains and hidden passes. Its lords did not fight the way the lords of the Reach fought. They did not assemble enormous hosts on open plains and trust to cavalry charges and organized formations. They moved, they scattered, they dissolved before a superior force and reformed behind it. They struck at supply lines and sleeping camps and the soft underbelly of logistics. They were, in the vocabulary of war, impossible to defeat through conventional means because they refused to stand in a place where conventional means applied. Rhaenys flew to Dorne first. She arrived at Sunspear and found the city abandoned. The gates were open. The halls were empty. There was no army to face, no lord to demand an oath from. The people of Sunspear had simply left when they heard the dragon was coming, spreading into the deserts and the passes where a dragon could not efficiently follow. Rhaenys and Meraxes burned some empty towers. It accomplished nothing. She reportedly asked where the Dornish were and received no answer she could use. Dorne did not submit. Meria Martell sent back what has become one of the more memorable communications in the history of the Conquest. She said Dorne had no king for Aegon to defeat. She had no army for his dragons to burn. He might burn her towns, she acknowledged, but she had no intention of making his conquest easy, and he would never hold Dorne as long as any Dornishman was alive and willing to resist. This was not bluster. It was accurate intelligence about the nature of the problem Aegon faced. For years, the Dornish resistance ground on. It ground on in the fashion Dorne had always practiced, not in great battles, but in small ones. Ambushes on Aegon's patrols, attacks on his appointed lords, supply lines cut and burned, wells fouled, roads made dangerous after dark. Every time Aegon sent men into the Dornish passes, men came back in smaller numbers than they had gone in. The cost was not catastrophic in any single engagement. It accumulated, and then came the day that changed the war entirely. Rhaenys Targaryen flew Meraxes over Dorne on a raid, as she had done many times before. The Dornish had been watching those raids, learning from them, waiting for the pattern to become predictable. The Dornish had positioned scorpions, enormous bolt-throwing engines, the kind built for fortress walls and designed to bring down siege towers, in the places where Meraxes typically flew low and slow on her return passes. One of those bolts found her. It struck at the most vulnerable point a dragon has. Meraxes screamed and fell. Rhaenys fell with her. What happened to them in the castle where Meraxes came down is one of the silences of history. Rhaenys was not recovered. She was not ransomed. No body was returned, no acknowledgement made, no terms offered for her safe return. Aegon sent messengers demanding to know what had become of his sister wife. Some of those messengers came back, others did not. The ones who returned brought no answers, only silence, and the clear message that Dorne had no intention of offering any. The grief that fell on Aegon was not the clean grief of a king who has lost an ally. Rhaenys had been his wife, his companion, the woman who had flown south and charmed lords and kings with her warmth and her humour, while Visenya's colder precision held the military side together. She had been one of the 3 pillars of the Conquest, and she was gone. What followed is sometimes called the Dragon's Wrath in older texts, and it deserves the name. Aegon mounted Balerion and flew over Dorne for a period the records describe as the better part of a year, burning everything he could find. towns, keeps, watchtowers. He burned the granaries and the water cisterns. He burned the strongholds and the roads leading to them. He flew and he burned, and he did not stop until the smoke rising over the red mountains was visible from ships at sea. And dawn endured it. The people hid in the deep desert and in the high mountain passes where a dragon could not easily follow, and they waited for him to exhaust himself or run out of things to burn or simply stop. They could not defeat Balerion in the sky. They had already demonstrated, with Meraxes, that even a dragon could be brought down if the conditions were right, but Aegon was no longer flying with the relaxed confidence of a man who expects no threat. He was flying with fury, and fury kept him moving and unpredictable. Still, Dawn did not submit. The assassination attempts began in earnest, not on commanders or regional lords, on Aegon himself. Dornish agents moved through King's Landing, through the Red Keep, through the supply network of the realm. 2 attempts are recorded with some confidence. Others are suspected. Visenya, whose talent for violence was never in question, began sleeping with her sword within arm's reach, and changed the door of Aegon's chambers on a rotating schedule. On one occasion, by the most common telling, assassins penetrated even those precautions and found themselves in the same room as the king before Visenya's blade found them. The Dornish war dragged on for years without resolution, absorbing resources and men and the king's attention in ways that nothing else in the Conquest had required. The rest of Westeros, newly bent, watched this stalemate with something between anxiety and quiet interest. It demonstrated something important about the limits of dragon power. That fire could destroy, but it could not hold what it destroyed. Dawn proved that the dragons were not omnipotent. A people willing to suffer could outlast even fire. Meria Martell died without ever submitting. She died in the desert somewhere, old and blind, at the head of a people who had burned and scattered, and refused to break for longer than anyone had predicted. She was succeeded by her son Mors, who continued the same policy. Mors died. Daria Martell, his daughter, inherited the resistance. What finally ended the Dornish war was not a military victory. It was a letter. Princess Daria Martell sailed to King's Landing and was given safe conduct to meet with Aegon, carrying with her a letter and a small box. The contents of both are not recorded in any source that has survived with certainty. What is recorded is the effect. Aegon read the letter in private. He held the box. He screamed. Once, a sound that those outside the door heard and did not forget. He walked out to the Iron Throne, sat down on it, and sat in silence for a long time. Whatever was in that letter, whatever was in that box, it ended the war. Terms were agreed, though they looked nothing like the terms Aegon had extracted from every other kingdom. Dawn did not bend the knee. What emerged was closer to an uneasy peace than a conquest. An understanding between 2 parties who had worn each other down and found no clean victory on either side. The Martells kept the title of prince rather than lord, a distinction that preserved their separation from the other great houses. Dawn would remain its own thing, governed by its own customs for another century and more, until marriage finally drew the 2 lines together. But the war was over, and Aegon sat on the Iron Throne with the shadow of that letter behind his eyes, and ruled. The counting of the years is a strange thing when you look at the Conquest in full. What we call Aegon's Conquest is the story of approximately 2 years of active military campaigning, followed by years of consolidation, adjustment, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes after a great effort, has achieved its purpose and left the achiever standing in the middle of something larger than he fully anticipated. Aegon had come with 3 dragons, 2 sister wives, and a small army. He left behind, eventually, a realm of 6 kingdoms that had bent the knee, and a 7th that had worn the war to a standstill and kept its own ways. He had ended one royal line outright at the Field of Fire, when the last Gardener King died in the flames. He had given another's seat to his most trusted commander. He had bent the remaining 4 through a combination of fire and offer, terror and generosity, the 2 instruments of his campaign working in alternation. What he built was not perfect. What he built was not, by the standards of later centuries, stable. The realm he handed to his heirs would require constant maintenance, would crack along old fault lines more than once, would eventually produce civil wars that consumed half its dragons and rewrote its succession. The realm was not an achievement completed. It was an achievement begun. But it was real. He had done what no conqueror before him had managed. Not the first men in their deep, ancient waves across the continent from the east. Not the Andals, who had crossed the sea and pushed the first men back, but had never unified the south into a single structure. Not the 100 petty kings who had spent millennia fighting each other across every river and mountain range on the map. Aegon had taken a continent of separate powers and made one realm of it. The governing structure he put in place was practical rather than idealistic. The great lords kept their lands. This was not generosity for its own sake. It was recognition that Aegon did not have the administrative machinery to replace the existing lordships, and that trying to do so would have required a permanent occupying force beyond anything he could field. The lords who had ruled their regions for generations understood those regions in ways that imported administrators could not. They had local loyalty, local knowledge, local authority. To destroy them entirely would have required rebuilding from nothing, and rebuilding from nothing tends to collapse into chaos. Instead, Aegon left the old structure largely in place and placed himself above it. The king was supreme. The king's word was law above any lord's word, any tradition, any local custom. The king could summon armies, could tax, could judge, could override any lord who stepped outside the bounds of the new order. But the king did not reach down into the daily governance of the Reach or the Westerlands or the Stormlands and rearrange the furniture. The Tyrells still managed the Reach. The Lannisters still managed the West. The Arryns still managed the Vale. The Starks still managed the North. They were lords paramount now, not kings, but their actual authority over their regions was not dramatically diminished. The difference was symbolic and also very real. Symbolic in the sense that they no longer called themselves kings. Their crowns were gone. Their independence was conditional on the pleasure of the Iron Throne, rather than the strength of their own arms. Real in that, if they ever tested those conditions, they could now look east toward Dragonstone and remember what had happened to Harren the Black. The dream beneath the Conquest was never far from Aegon's private thinking. He had seen, in whatever form the dragon dream had taken him, the long night coming again. He had seen the cold descending from the north. He had seen what happened to a divided continent when something moved against it that did not distinguish between Reach and Rock, Vale and Stormlands. A divided Westeros would fall region by region to any threat large enough to overwhelm a single kingdom. A united Westeros, under a strong king, with the capacity to summon every great house's strength at once, might hold. He supported the Night's Watch. Tradition holds that he sent gifts to the Wall and looked favorably on the Black Brothers in ways that earlier lords had not always done. He took seriously what the North had always known and the South had mostly forgotten, that the Wall existed for a reason, and that reason was not yet exhausted. Whether the other great lords understood this, or whether they simply understood that the king wished it done, the Wall received what it needed to function. This was, in miniature, how Aegon's kingdom worked. He held a purpose in himself that most of his lords did not share and did not need to share. He needed them functional, loyal, and capable. He did not need them to dream his dream. He needed them to hold their ground when he told them to. Aegon ruled for 37 years. He was crowned twice, once at his own ceremony, improvised and brief, shortly after the Conquest. Once more properly, after the High Septon formally anointed him, with all the ceremony the faith could provide. He visited all the great regions of the realm, sat in the halls of the houses that had bent to him, accepted fealty from a second generation of lords who had grown up knowing no other world than the one he had made. He was not a perfect king, if such a thing exists. His court had its troubles. The faith eventually chafed against the Targaryen practice of polygamy and sibling marriage, something that would turn, in the generations after, into open conflict. The seeds of future discord were planted even in the years of apparent stability, but those are other stories for other fires. Aegon the Conqueror died at Dragonstone in the year 37 AC, having never entirely left the island behind. He went there often, in his later years, back to the dark volcanic stone, the cold sea air, the place where his family had waited for a century while Valyria burned and the world changed around them. It was where he had grown up. It was where the dream had come to him. It was, in some way, he may not have been able to articulate to anyone who asked, still home. He died as he had lived, purposeful, quiet in the way that men with iron certainties are quiet, carrying the weight of a dream that he had committed the better part of a lifetime to making real. Visenya outlived him. Rhaenys had gone into the Dornish sands decades before, and whatever was in that box that Daria Martell brought to King's Landing remained between Aegon and the silence he took his answer to. The realm passed to his son, Ennis. The realm began, almost immediately, to fray at the edges in ways that Aegon's presence had prevented, because what his presence had been was a reminder, a living reminder of what it had cost to resist. A man who had ridden Balerion, a man who had stood on the field of fire and watched the grass burn, a man whose dragons had melted Harrenhal into a shape that stone never forgets. Without him, the reminder faded. The realm remained, but the man who had made it was gone. The Conquest is not difficult to narrate. The sequence of events is clear enough. What is harder, and what matters more in the long run, is understanding what Aegon actually won, and what the winning of it cost, and what it left incomplete. He won the map. Every region of Westeros, even Dorne in its grudging and nominal way, acknowledged that a Targaryen sat a throne in King's Landing, and that throne was the highest power in the land. That acknowledgement was real. It was backed by fire. It persisted for nearly 300 years through civil wars and succession crises, and the slow death of the dragons, and the eventual end of the line itself. The realm Aegon made outlasted the dragons that made it, which is perhaps the more remarkable achievement. He had built something that did not require constant fire to hold its shape. But the winning of the map was not the same as the winning of the realm's heart. The great lords had bent. They had bent because they had seen what the alternative looked like in the ruins of Harrenhal and on the burned ground of the Field of Fire. That bending was genuine in its way. Lords are practical people, and practical people adapt to new realities. The Lannisters became loyal Targaryen subjects across several generations because that loyalty served them better than the alternative. The Tyrells became the Crown's great friends because the Conquest had made them great. The Starks bent once at the Trident and kept their oaths faithfully for centuries because that faithfulness was who they were. But the logic of that loyalty was always conditional on the Targaryens remaining what Aegon had been. Capable, formidable, worthy of the fire they carried. When later Targaryens proved otherwise, the oaths began to fray. Aegon had built a realm on the premise that the Targaryens would be strong enough to deserve what they held. He had not built in any mechanism for the weaker kings that would follow. The Iron Throne was sharp and cut those who sat on it, yes, but that was philosophy. It was not policy. The realm had no alternative structure for the moment when the king was a fool or a madman or a child. What held it together in those moments was the loyalty of the great lords, which was real but not infinite. The Conquest, for all its fire, was also a lesson in the limits of force. Dawn taught that. The Dornish could not defeat the dragons. They demonstrated instead that even something as absolute as dragonfire could not compel what it could not reach. You cannot burn a people that is scattered into the desert. You cannot hold territory with ash. The fire was supreme in the open field and against stone walls and in the burning of supply lines. The fire was not supreme against patient human endurance, against people who understood that survival was its own form of victory. The Dornish lesson would echo forward through Targaryen history in ways that were not always recognized as connected. The dragons could destroy, they could not govern. What governed was the old human machinery of loyalty, oath, marriage, trade, and the slow work of shared interest. Aegon understood this better than many of his successors, which is why his settlement of the great houses was so careful about preserving their dignity. Dignity costs nothing to give and buys a great deal. Humiliation is cheap in the moment and expensive forever. The Iron Throne was his most honest legacy. The throne itself, not the title, not the armies, not even the dragons that outlasted him by only a few generations, was a truer summary of what he had built than anything a maester could write. A kingdom made of blades, sharp, dangerous to hold, requiring every occupant to pay attention or bleed. He had taken the weapons of those he defeated and made them into the seat of power. There was a dark honesty in that. He was not pretending the Conquest had been something graceful. He was not building a throne of gold and velvet and pretending the swords had not mattered. The swords were the throne. The violence was the foundation. He looked at that clearly, and he kept looking at it clearly for 37 years, and the clarity was part of what made his reign stable. The men who came after him could not always bear that clarity. Some tried to ignore the blades and sat comfortably until the cuts reminded them. Some tried to add cushions, metaphorically, to soften what was essentially unsoftenable. Some simply stopped paying attention and bled. The realm survived them all, mostly, because Aegon's structure had enough depth to absorb bad kingship for a generation or two before it genuinely threatened to break. That depth was his real gift, not the conquest, not the fire, the understanding baked into the bones of what he built, that a realm needed more than a strong man at its head. It needed lords with stakes in its continuation. It needed small folk who could live their lives without constant disruption. It needed a faith that felt recognized. It needed the North remembering the Wall. He had given it all of those things. He had also given it a throne that cut. Whether the men who came after him were worthy of the cut was a question each generation answered differently. There is one more thing the Conquest settled, in ways that only become visible from a distance. Before Aegon, the continent had been arranged in a pattern that rewarded a certain kind of ambition. The ambition of a king who wanted to be the greatest power among many powers. Every generation produced lords and kings who measured themselves against their neighbours. The Gardeners against the Lannisters, the Durandons against the Martells, the Starks against every king beyond the Wall, and every rival within the North. The energy of Westeros had been spent, for thousands of years, in horizontal competition, kingdom against kingdom, the strong consuming the weak, then becoming fat and slow and consumed in turn. Aegon redirected that energy upward. The redirection was neither immediate nor complete. The lords still competed for proximity to the crown, for marriages and trade agreements and the favour of the king's ear, for the wardenship of this march or that coast. But the competition no longer aimed at the throne of one's own region. It aimed at position within a larger structure. And that shift, small as it might seem, changed what ambition looked like in Westeros for the next 3 centuries. The great civil wars that came later, the Dance of Dragons, the Blackfire rebellions, were not wars between independent kingdoms trying to survive. They were contests over who sat the single throne. That distinction matters. Even in its fractures, the realm Aegon built remained a realm. Its conflicts were arguments about its succession, not attempts to unmake it entirely. He had made himself and the idea of unified kingship so central to Westeros that even those who would tear the realm apart fought over the shape of the centre, rather than whether there should be a centre at all. That is the deepest victory, not Harrenhal, not the Field of Fire. The fact that 300 years later, when the realm fractured, the fracture was still about who held the throne he made. A man rode a black dragon across the sky of Westeros. He burned the tower that could not burn. He stood over the field where the grass turned to ash. He sat on a throne built from the swords of the people he had defeated, and he held the realm together for 37 years, and he left it to his heirs with the instruction that it must be held. The instruction outlasted the man, outlasted the dragons, outlasted the dynasty. Whether it outlasted the winter is the only question that was ever worth asking. And the fire on the hearth burns lower now. The hour is late. The story of how a continent was remade by 3 dragons and the purpose of a silver-haired man who dreamed of cold. That story is finished, or as finished as any story of this kind ever gets. The aftermath stretches on. The consequences deepen. The realm found new ways to fray and new moments to hold. But the conquest, the act of it, the fire and the kneeling and the throne being made of blades, that ended when Aegon sat down and ruled. And the dream behind it, the dream of ice and fire, the dream that drove everything, that did not end at all. It simply waited, as cold things do.